It all began at the exact moment my eyes met his, without warning, without context, without sound, just a presence that imposed itself as if the entire world had fallen silent to make room for that instant. I was already accustomed to the flow of the station, the fleeting and indifferent faces, the hurried footsteps echoing around me while my fingers danced across the keys. There was a comfortable solitude in the habit of playing there. I didn't expect glances, didn't expect applause. Music was my way of speaking what I couldn't say aloud, and I played it like someone confessing without expecting comfort. But that day, something different happened. A man, tall, with serene features and eyes as dense as if they carried unspoken memories, stopped. He didn't hesitate, didn't check his phone, didn't feign disinterest. He just stopped, with a stillness so profound it cut through the air, and stayed there, as if listening to me with his entire body. But then I realized he wasn't listening. He was feeling. At first I didn't understand. His eyes followed the movement of my fingers, and there was something in the way he tilted his head slightly, as if he were tracing the notes through another perception, another frequency. It was only on the third day that I realized he was deaf, and yet, or perhaps because of it, he seemed to absorb everything about me in a way no one ever had. He sat on the same bench, always at the same time, always in the same spot. I began to wait for him without admitting it to myself. Playing felt different when he was there. My fingers seemed lighter, as if they wanted to speak directly to him. As if my skin sought to reach his through the cold keys of the piano, and when, for some reason, he didn't show up, an unease took hold of me. I started wondering who he was, what he did, if he lived nearby or was just passing through. But more than that, I wondered why it was with him, of all people, that my soul seemed to connect. Without words, without grand gestures, without even knowing his voice, which I might never hear. Even so, even in absolute silence, it was as if we were building something between the invisible and the inevitable. The next morning, I woke with an anxiety that didn't seem to belong to the day. There was a strange restlessness in me, as if part of my body were anticipating events. I arrived at the station earlier than usual, adjusted the bench, reviewed the sheet music. I never really followed and waited. People came and went, some recognized my face, others didn't notice me. I played, but not like before. I was distracted, my heart playing in anticipation of a specific gaze, and every minute he didn't appear felt like a measure without rhythm. When the clock marked the end of the time he usually arrived, I felt a strange emptiness. It wasn't just absence. It was as if something that had already become part of me had been invisibly torn away, silently but violently. The following days, I played with a weight in my chest. My body was there, but my soul was restless, as if the piano, which had always been my refuge, now betrayed me by not being enough to bring him back. I tried to rationalize. Maybe he had traveled. Maybe he was sick. Maybe it was just chance. But chance doesn't explain the longing for someone you've never even spoken to. And then when I no longer expected it, he reappeared. He was different. His eyes a little deeper, his shoulders less relaxed, as if he had been through something heavy. But it was still him. When he saw me, he stopped exactly where he always did, but this time he didn't sit. He stood watching me, and his gaze carried something new, something that asked for forgiveness and at the same time said, "I'm back." I didn't know how to react. My body trembled, as if all the music I'd held back wanted to pour out at once. I played for him in that moment, and it was the rawest, most sincere, and most imperfect melody I'd ever let escape my fingers. I didn't care if the chords faltered. I just wanted him to know I had felt his absence with my entire being. When the last note faded into the air, He stood still for a few seconds, then approached slowly. My heart raced. He opened his bag and took out something, a carefully folded piece of paper. He placed it on the piano and stepped back. I didn't move immediately. I was paralyzed by fear and enchantment. When I finally opened the note, I saw a simple drawing, a pair of hands playing a piano, and above them, a heart pulsing in place of the musical notes. I smiled, and in that smile, I understood everything. That was our conversation. That was him saying he missed me. It was his way of telling me that, even in silence, he was with me. After that day, something changed irreversibly between us. He started coming every day, more punctual than the train itself, and with each new appearance, a new gesture. A book left beside the piano with a page marked by a dried petal. An envelope with an old photograph of a blooming tree, as if telling me he awaited spring even on cloudy days, and sometimes just him. With his serene posture and that gaze full of meaning, I responded in my own way. I played new compositions, created from the feelings he stirred in me, a softer melody when he approached with a tired face, firmer chords when he came with bright eyes, as if he wanted to tell me something only his body understood. I began keeping all his notes, all his images, all his signs. It was as if we were building an entire story in fragments, a silent narrative only the two of us could decipher. People around us noticed, though discreetly. An older woman passed by and said, smiling, "You two have a beautiful way of talking." I just nodded, unsure what to say, because she was right. We were talking, just not with words, with what we felt. And the more time passed, the more I found myself consumed by him, by the way he looked at me, the way he listened without hearing, the way he understood me in the details so many others overlooked. I don't know when the piano stopped being just my refuge and became our bridge, but when I realized it, I was already waiting for him like someone waiting for the sun after gray days. I no longer cared if the rest of the world understood us. There, in that space between the keys and the gestures, between the silences and the glances, there was something too real to be named. It was one late afternoon, with the sky lightly pink, that he approached with something different in his hands. It was a small, simple wooden box, without ornaments. He placed it beside me, waited for me to finish the melody, and gestured for me to open it. Inside was a delicate bracelet with tiny wooden pieces carved into musical notes. But what took my breath away was the pendant in the center, a miniature piano with the universal symbol for silence engraved beneath it. I looked at him and for the first time saw his eyes not just intense, but vulnerable. And in that moment, I understood that this was more than a gift. It was a confession. It was the answer the world expected to hear in other forms, but between us, it could only be said like this. In silence, I started thinking of him outside the station. His image began appearing in my thoughts as often as the sound of the keys in my mind. I saw him in small, everyday gestures, in the leaves dancing with the wind, in bookstore windows, in the reflection of light through the subway window. I never needed to hear his voice to know he was part of me. It was enough to remember the way he looked at me, like someone who listens with their eyes, who understands what no one else perceives. I began composing for him even away from the piano. I scribbled melodies on napkins, jotted notes in small notebooks, trying to translate the feeling that grew quietly, but with undeniable strength. It was love. I knew it. Not the kind of love that explodes or declares itself loudly. It was a silent love, but immense. The kind that grows in the spaces between and blooms in the pauses between one gesture and another. One afternoon, I decided I needed to learn to speak to him in his language. I began studying sign language discreetly. At first, it was frustrating. My fingers disobeyed, my memory faltered, but the desire to reach his world was stronger than any difficulty. Each new sign learned was a door opening. I wanted to surprise him. I wanted to show that what we had wasn't just a fleeting enchantment, but something that deserved depth. Meanwhile, he continued expressing himself with his notes, drawings, and small gifts. Each gesture of his was a story, and I more and more felt part of a universe that had once been unknown to me, but was now strangely familiar. It was one weekend when he invited me for the first time to leave the station. A simple invitation made with a gesture pointing to the sky, then to a place on a hand-drawn map. It was a park, not far from there. I accepted with my heart racing. Walking beside him in silence was one of the most intense experiences of my life. Neither of us needed to say anything, and yet everything was said. We shared an ice cream. We laughed with our eyes. He lightly touched my arm when a child ran toward us. And in that touch, there was more tenderness than in any words ever spoken by someone who tried to love me. Night fell slowly, and he led me to a tree where he had carved something, a drawing of two hands touching amid sheet music. Below, the word understanding written in firm letters. I was moved. He looked at me, and in that look, there was a question. I didn't answer. With words, I just extended my hand, touched the carving with my fingertips, and then brought them to my heart. He understood. He smiled. A slow, serene smile, full of meaning. That moment, in that place, was like a silent promise between us. That's when a new phase of our story began, where silence was no longer an In the days that followed, our bond grew stronger with a naturalness that seemed to defy time. The train station was no longer just the place where we met, but the sanctuary where it all began, and even outside, in the streets, parks, and quiet. Cafes he chose with care. There was a silent, profound communion between us, made of respect, listening, and presence. I continued studying sign language in secret, practicing at night in front of the mirror, making mistakes, starting over, getting emotional with each gesture learned. I wanted him to feel how seriously I took him, how much his world deserved, to be understood with the same dedication he showed in understanding mine. And the more I immersed myself in that learning, the more I realized how generous silence could be, how much it could hold and reveal. There was one day in particular I'll never forget. It was raining, one of those fine, persistent rains that seemed to wrap the world in a mantle of introspection. He was waiting for me, leaning against one of the station's columns, with an umbrella and a smile that seemed to warm everything around. When he saw me, he extended his hand. The rain fell around us, but between us there was a shelter, not just physical, but emotional. We walked under the umbrella as if time didn't press us, as if the rest of the world had been turned off. We stopped in front of the piano, and he gestured for me not to play. For a moment I felt lost, until he pulled a small notebook from his pocket. In it were drawings of us, small moments captured in simple lines. Me playing with my eyes closed, him watching me with a discreet smile, our hands close, almost touching over the piano. On the last page, a single word written by hand. Feel. I wanted to respond. I wanted to say so much. But instead of trying to translate the whirlwind of emotions into words, I took a deep breath and pulled out a note I'd been carrying for days, waiting for the right moment. In my trembling handwriting, I had drawn the phrase, "I'm learning to speak with my hands, so you'll never lack an answer." He read it slowly. When he finished, his eyes filled with tears. And then he did something he'd never done before. He held my face with both hands, with a gentleness that completely disarmed me, and brought his forehead to mine. We stayed like that still, feeling only each other's breath, the warmth of his hands, the silence that enveloped us like a sacred song. And in that moment I knew, without doubt, without fear, without haste, that what we had didn't need translation. Because it was already love in its purest form. Everything seemed to be heading toward a place of peace, until reality, as it always does, decided to test what was growing between us. He started arriving later. Sometimes he didn't show up at all. When he came, he carried a tiredness in his eyes that wasn't just physical. It was as if he bore a struggle he didn't want to share, a weight that silenced him more than any absence of sound. I noticed, of course. Every movement of his said more than any words, and despite all the care we had for each other, there were things we still didn't know how to say. I tried to respect his space, to give him time, to give him air. But the silence, which had once been our bridge, began to feel like a wall, and that hurt in a new way, a way I couldn't put into notes or on paper. One afternoon, when the wind blew colder than usual, I found him sitting in front of the piano. For the first time, he was there before me. His eyes were down, fixed on the keys, and there was something broken in his expression. When he saw me, he stood slowly without haste, as if he knew he was about to do something difficult. He handed me a carefully folded sheet, as if it were too fragile for the world. I held it without understanding, feeling the tension in his fingers when our hands brushed. He didn't look me in the eyes. He just turned and walked slowly through the station, his shoulders hunched as if carrying a farewell in his bones. I stood there with the sheet in my hand and my heart in suspense. When I opened it, I found simple, direct lines, but full of restrained feeling. He didn't say he was leaving, but he was. He didn't explain the reasons, only apologized for not being able to stay. He said he needed to resolve things he couldn't share with me, not yet. And at the end, a single sentence broke me. You gave me sound in silence. That's why I carry you with me. I pressed the note to my chest, closed my eyes and breathed deeply, as if I could hold that absence inside me in a way that didn't hurt so much. In the days that followed, I played like someone sewing a broken heart. The melodies that once celebrated his presence now mourned his absence. But still, I returned to the station. Still, I played. Because even if he wasn't there, I felt, somehow, that he was still listening with his body, with his memory, with his heart. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. And time, that silent sculptor of emotions, carved in me a new way of missing him. The station remained my refuge, but it was no longer just the place where we played for each other without words. It became the place where I stayed faithful to what we had lived, even in absence, even in doubt. I kept playing, not as someone expecting an audience, but as someone writing letters to the wind, hoping one might find its destination. Some days, my heart hurt so much that my fingers trembled on the keys. Others, a strange peace came, as if deep down I knew that what was real doesn't unravel so easily. It was one autumn evening when everything changed. I was finishing a slow melody, full of silent pauses, when I felt a shiver run down my spine, not from cold but from presence. I looked up and saw him. He was there, in the same spot as always, with the same intense eyes, but now with something different in them, something more mature, more resolved, more whole. My heart raced, and for a moment I was afraid to stand, afraid it was a memory, a dream, a trick of my longing. But he took a step, and then another, and then he walked toward me, without haste, as if he knew every second mattered. When he reached the piano, he pulled something from his pocket, a notebook, the same one he'd used to draw our first encounters, and now, as he opened it, I saw there was more, many pages, drawings of places I didn't know, of people, of moments. And in almost every page, there I was, me playing, me smiling, me waiting. He looked at me and for the first time signed with his hands, with fluency, with intention, with clarity. And I understood, because I had learned too. Not just the signs, but what lay behind them. With firm gestures, he told me what had kept him away. A family illness, old issues that needed resolving, a part of his life he'd always kept at a distance because he didn't know if I'd be willing to know it. But now, he was there, saying he wanted to share everything, that he didn't want silence where there was room for truth. I responded the only way I knew how, by playing. My fingers glided over the keys as if they finally knew the right path, and as he watched me, sitting beside me, I felt the music was different now. It had passed through the grief of absence, the pain of waiting, the stubborn hope, and it was reborn stronger. That same night, we walked together to the end of the station. The lights dim, the distant sound of the last train, and then he stopped, took my hand, for the first time, with firmness, with decision, and drew a small sign over his chest, as if keeping there what we were. I smiled, and with my hands finally steady, I replied, "You never left here." And that's when I understood that the love born without a word had become impossible to silence. Because in the end, it wasn't about what we said. It was about what we knew about each other, even in the deepest silence. A few weeks later, he took me to a place I didn't know, a spacious room with perfect acoustics, a grand piano in the center, surrounded by tall windows that let in the late afternoon light as if it too were part of the composition. It wasn't a concert. There was no audience. It was just us. And yet, I'd never felt so seen. He sat in front of me, opened a new notebook of blank pages, and signed, "Play our story." My heart raced. For the first time, I realized there was no more pain in looking at everything we'd lived. There was beauty, depth, memory, and resurrection. My hands played the first chord, and I felt each note was laden not just with sound, but with everything that had crossed us. The shock of the first glance, the discovery of shared silence, the jolt of absence, the joy of return, the strength of beginning again. He drew as I played, and between each stroke that appeared on the paper, between each sound that filled the air, there was a silent pact being reaffirmed. Life might not give us all the guarantees, but there, in that moment suspended in time, I knew what we had didn't need formal promises. It was subtler and stronger than that. It was the kind of love that is born in details, grows in the unspoken, and blooms in care. When I finished, he approached, took my hand, and with slow gestures asked if I wanted to learn to play the world as he heard it. I answered with a light kiss on the tips of his fingers, the same gesture he'd once used to thank me for a melody. And there, between sound and silence, between gesture and touch, we sealed something that had existed long before we knew how to name it, belonging. We began writing a book together. I with words, he with drawings, a narrative that didn't follow a logical order but recorded everything. The ordinary days, the moments of light, the pauses, the signs, the reunions. A book that didn't need to be published because it was already complete every time we opened it between us. On one of the final pages, I wrote a sentence that summed it all up. We met in silence, and there we made our home. He read it, drew a heart pulsing between two intertwined pairs of hands, and smiled with that same calm, meaningful smile that had captivated me from the start, and so we continued. Not as two who overcame silence, but as two who learned to inhabit it together, and to transform it into a home. Years have passed since that reunion, but we still meet every day. Even when the world insists on rushing, even when sounds get lost in the chaos of daily life. Today, our mornings begin with coffee and shared silence, as if each sip were a soft chord. We play little, speak even less, but feel everything. Music remains our language, and silence our home. Our love never needed promises. It simply is. Constant, mature, full of roots. Some stories don't need complex plots or eloquent words. Some stories are written with gestures, eyes, and a piano in the background. And ours, it still plays, every day.